If I asked you to describe your financial situation, could you accurately tell me where you are, what you have? Would you even be willing to? No matter what your situation is, I promise you, I've heard worse. I'm Sara McCullough, certified financial planner and certified divorce financial analyst, and I'm sharing some of the stories I've experienced over my career, taking those lessons and turning them into actionable steps for you to use. This is I've Heard Worse. The mistakes that people make with their finances usually fall into one of two categories. You either are doing too much of something or you're doing too little of something. So this episode will go over the too much, and the next episode will go over too little. What do those mistakes look like? How do you recognize when you're making them? And how do you solve them? So today, it's all about too much. Too much focus on a single area, too much emotion in your decision-making, and too much prioritizing the present at the expense of the future. So how can we make a mistake with too much focus on one area? Isn't focus good? Doesn't that mean that we know everything we need to know and we're making good decisions? Not necessarily, because what we're possibly doing is isolating that one area and not accounting for the fact that all of our financial areas are connected. When we choose one thing, the other things are going to shift. Whether we acknowledge it or not, there will be a shift. And that might not be what we wanted. So we might have gotten what we wanted in one area, but we're not going to get what we want in other areas. And those other areas might be a bigger deal. So let me give you a brief example about what can happen when we focus too much on investment fees. This is a hot topic. So the reason you can get caught in this is because there are Facebook groups devoted to this, Reddits devoted to this, subreddits. It's all over the place. This is a hot topic. Don't pay more than you need to. If you pay an advisor, you're an idiot. On and on and on. So the information we get bombarded with is lower is better. That's about it. That's all we get bombarded with. That's the message. If you're paying anything more than the absolute lowest fees, you're basically giving up your whole retirement. That's what the commercials tell us. That's what the media tells us. That's what the socials tell us. So it's easy and it's clear, right? It's one thing, like we can see this. 0.3% is a lot smaller than 1.5%. And we can then go scribble down for our own investment accounts. What is that number? What is that? What am I paying? Here's the problem though. If you ignore other planning areas, whether you pay 0.3% as a management expense ratio on your investments or 1.5%, that's not going to get you to the retirement you want on its own. There's lots of other things that you need to do to meet your goals. That's not going to buy you a cottage. That's not going to pay off your car loan. That difference alone, despite what media tells you, despite what marketing tells you, that's not going to get you there. You need to look at all of your other planning areas. Are you saving enough? Is your risk level and risk capacity of the investments in line with your situation? So those are kind of the immediate questions that are close to this idea of management fees and investment fees. So on its own, it's not going to solve it. It needs other things. And sometimes we focus on that decision and exclude far bigger questions. And I'm going to give you an example that I know is going to make clear to you how we can get too much focus in one area and why that would be a mistake. One of my previous clients was very focused on investment fees. And we had a lot of really long conversations about this. And he was married. He was working partner was a stay-at-home parent, and they had 2 small children. And we had long, long discussions about investment fees. And what about this? And what if I do this? Well, why can't I this? I want this lower over here. I don't like this. And I would say, have you gotten your will done yet? Because these parents didn't have a will. And so they were spending all this time, Dad was spending all this time collecting information on investment fees and not spending that time and energy on getting a will. If he had died, financially, the family should have been fine. But with 2 minor children in Ontario, his wife would not have inherited everything. Most of the assets were in his name. They were not joint. They held their money separately for various reasons. There were 2 corporations that held most of the assets. He was the sole shareholder. So if he had died without a will, she didn't have access to those corporations. She would have had to have gone to court to get access. The assets would have been divided between her and the children. When I last did the estimate, his minor children would have inherited about $4 million each in their own names. That's not what the parents wanted. There was life insurance. There was adequate life insurance that was owned by the corporations because that was tax efficient. Lots of us like being tax efficient. So he was tax efficient. And the insurance was paid for by the corporation, which also means that when he dies, the insurance company writes the check to the corporation that the wife didn't have access to. So this family had money. They would have been financially stable with a will, with planning. The focus on investment fees, even though the difference was large because their investment pool was large. I acknowledge this was a large difference between 0.3 and 1.5, but it was not as large as the difference between having a will and not having a will. So do you see that it is possible to overly focus and you're really operating as if there are no connections between your financial areas? And that's not true. There are connections. So when you operate like there aren't connections, you're going to strand all of those other areas. And all of those other areas might be really valuable to you. But if you aren't touching them, if you aren't looking at them, and if you're spending all of your energy and time that you have available in the category of finance, if you're spending it all on the fee question, you're not getting to these other things. So how do you know that you're doing this? If you think you might be doing it, I do want you to write down your question or your frustration. If investment fees is your thing, write it down for sure. You need an answer to that. You deserve an answer to that. I've had very long conversations. I have about a 10-page email conversation with a client on exactly this question. And that second client, where we had this long email conversation because it was happening at the beginning of COVID, the reason I was not as worked up for that client was because I knew he had a will, because I knew all of his other areas were actually had been touched on. They were under control, that this was at that moment his biggest burning question. And so write down your biggest thing, write down what you've been working on. And then I want you to also just do a scan across the other financial planning areas. And there'll be a link in the show notes for you so that you can see what those are. I want you to do a quick scan and look at, oh, is there anything I've neglected in here? What else have I not done because I've been doing this thing? And I really want you to just put a star beside, I haven't touched this, I haven't looked at that. And I want you to put 5 stars beside one that you say, I know I should get to this, and I've been putting it off. And then I want you to get to it. Don't lose track of what you were focusing on, but those other things need to get some airtime too. And they need to get answered, and they need to get planned for, and they need to get solved for you. Okay, so that's what you're going to do. If you think this is what you're doing, you're going to take a quick scan through that list of other planning areas. And then if you've got 5 stars, you're going to spend some time. That fee question or whatever question has been taking up your bandwidth is going to have to go on pause. It's going to have to wait. until you get some other things done. So emotion-based decision making. This is also an area where we can do too much of this and it can cause problems. And the area I'm going to give you some examples in is around priorities. And so listen to this sequence of thoughts that can happen in our heads when we're making financial decisions, kind of piece by piece, without a full plan. Maybe we're missing some information, but life happens fast, and so we do what we do. So I want you to just listen as I talk through this series of decisions, explanations, justifications. Maybe you bought your current home because it's in a good area, because it was close to a school that you wanted for your family. You liked the location, it was convenient, the house itself had features that you loved. Maybe you stretched a bit on the price. You went a little higher than you planned. But good area, great schools, can't beat the location. And then you bought a car because you have a long commute. So a safe, reliable, comfortable car is important. You stretched a bit on that price too. And you work hard, so it's fine. And then you booked a vacation. So you bought the house, bought the car. You booked a vacation recently because it's been a hard year and breaks are important and burnout is bad. And you stretched a little bit on paying for this vacation. But you should get a bonus or tax refund soon, and you deserve the vacation. And then the dryer broke and you need a new one. And then the house needs maintenance that you didn't expect this month. And then one more thing happens, and you're putting off saving one more time. Or now you're in debt that you can't see how to pay off. Does that sound familiar? If it doesn't sound familiar, it might sound easy. Did you hear how easily I strung all of those things together? It's so easy. Why is it so easy to do this? Because all of those things are true. And all of them are valuable. And we're bombarded with marketing that tells us we deserve it. Our lives will be better if we do this. We're bombarded with social posts that show us that everyone else has all of those things and it's easy for them. So why can't we have all those things too? And maybe you can. And while all of those things are true, they are also partially true. And partially true is dangerous to our thought processes because what we didn't do in that list was we didn't prioritize. So when we bought the house was our top priority. When we bought the car was our top priority. When we booked the vacation was the top priority. When we bought the dryer, obviously that was the top priority because we need dry clothes, right? So what can happen when we have too much emotion in our decision making and not enough prioritizing and saying no? We can land ourselves in a financially unstable spot that didn't need to happen because everything can't be top priority. That's not how the world works in anything, right? Again, the old saying, when one door closes, the door closed. If you made a choice, if you prioritize the house, something else has to step back a little bit. So when you say yes to one thing, you need to say to the other things, you car, get less of my money because I spent more over here. Or you vacation need to wait. Or maybe I'm going to vacation like this because I had to just replace the dryer, right? So do you see how you're not maybe saying no? Some things you are going to have to say no to. We all have limits. Doesn't matter how much money you have limits. So when we're prioritizing, part of prioritizing is making our other decisions line up behind the most important one. And we want that partly so we don't end up in a financially unstable position, but we also want it so that we're sure our resources are going first to the things that are most important to us. And that's going to be a little bit different for all of us. Some of us are going to prioritize a house more than others. I have a close friend of mine, she prioritizes her house much more than I do mine. And that's okay. My middle son prioritizes his car much more than I prioritize mine. I drive a Civic, he does not. So we all have different priorities, but what we all have to do is make sure that when we prioritize something, that we have all of our other decisions line up and we're constantly checking against that priority list. Because if we just use emotion, everything is important, everything is valuable, and we do deserve it. Absolutely. So all those things are true, but that's not where we should be basing our decisions from. And it's easy to fall into this. Again, because other people seem to have it all. Other people make it look easy because you're not there. You're not seeing the underneath. You're just seeing the surface. And sometimes we are able to pull it off. We can do this for a while before we run into trouble. Sometimes we can pull it off for years. And then one thing will happen that causes a more rapid downward spiral than we thought possible, because it was working for years until all of a sudden it didn't. So that's what can happen if we don't address this. So it's very easy to fall into. It's very normal. But if we aren't aware of it, it can be damaging. So how do you know if this is you? I want you to think about the last time you said no to yourself because you had already committed to something else that you wanted. So when did you say no to yourself? When did you scale back plans, a purchase? When did you cancel? When did you say no? Not this week, not this month, later. If I asked you, how much money can you spend every month without taking away from your future self, can you answer that question? Do you know? And if you can't answer this, you might be in the, I've been treating everything as top priority. You might be in that zone. The other way to tell if you're in this zone and it's becoming a problem, or it might be a problem, is take a look at your situation and ask yourself, what would happen if you lost your income? Like actually lost your income next week, what would happen? How are you going to keep everything going? Mortgage payments, loan payments, groceries, gas, clothes, heat, hydro, cell phone. How is that going to happen? And if that question sparks panic for you, two things. You're either living at the edge of your own affordability, and you probably kind of know it but don't want to face it directly, or you need to clarify your own situation. Because in my career, I have certainly had some people who panic when they don't need to, because that's just how they're built. They panic first, and they need to see the absolute worst case scenario before they can look at their own actual situation. Okay? And so just a reminder that financial planning clarifies when you need to panic. If you are my client and you need to panic, I will let you know. If you don't need to panic and you are panicking, I will also let you know. So if this is what you're doing, if you have been making decisions, your spending decisions are based on emotion, and you haven't been prioritizing, how do you fix this? Well, you're going to need to list out your net income, what lands in your bank account after taxes and deductions. Then you're going to list out just your fixed costs. Okay, so if this is new for you, if you're not sure at all where your money is going, that is okay. That is entirely normal. What I want for you is a starting point. So you're going to list out all of your fixed costs, and there will be a PDF in the show notes for you to do this. This is relatively quick to do, okay? So if you just heard me say, list out your income and expenses, and you had a budget moment panic because budgeting is awful and it's gross and it never works and it's just horrible, stop that, because that's not what we're doing. We are getting you some clarity though. So your fixed costs, fairly easy to find because they are the ones that give you an idea of how much of your income is already spent. So when your paycheck comes in, first of all, how much is it net? Not what you signed your employment contract for, not gross, net. How much lands? When does it land? And how much have you already spent? Because when you have a mortgage, you've already spent that money out of your paycheck. When you have a car loan, that money's already spent. You have a Netflix subscription, that money's already spent. Unless you do something very active to let go of that service, that money is already spent. Don't make another decision. Don't spend it twice. So if you do this exercise and you realize a high percentage of your money is already spent, the lifestyle that you've built doesn't give you any room for these things that we know are going to happen. When you own a house, you need to maintain a house. You know that expense is coming. You just don't know what day and how much. When you own a car, you know that you need to maintain it. We forget because these happen in irregular amounts in irregular time periods. So we don't account for them. So if you have a high percentage of your money already spent, your lifestyle isn't giving you room, and you've probably made a lot of emotional decisions in there, or you've ended up in a situation where your costs are just high. But again, you need to know that you don't have room. And what if you have a low percentage of fixed costs against your income, but your savings aren't building up? Like there's not a bigger balance in your bank account? Then you know that you're spending in the category of, we often call them extras, we call them fun, we call them I deserve it, we call it mindless stress spending sometimes. If your fixed expenses are low, but you're not seeing money in your bank account, it's these categories that are high. Okay? And so that should probably be reined in because future you is at risk. Today you may be fine. Future financial you might be in trouble. Okay? So that's how we work through, are you making financial decisions based on emotion? And how do you back yourself out of it? Slowly. Again, this is slow. Small change will add up. So let's talk about the third area that you can have too much in. Sometimes we prioritize the present too much. And this is entirely normal. In a lot of ways, this is how our financial transaction system is built. We do prioritize the present. This is how we're advised a lot of the time, especially in the accounting world. I am going to give you an example of a conversation I had with an accountant about a joint client. And what I often say to my clients is accountants really think in 12-month blocks. That's the extent of their timeline. And their goal for you is how little tax can you pay in this 12-month block. That's how they work. When I do financial planning for my clients, I am looking over time. I am looking at how do we manage their tax over a longer period of time? How do we manage their available income over a long period of time? So I'm not looking at 12-month blocks. Yes, I'm looking at those. And I'm looking at what happens long term, right? 2 buckets. If you haven't heard that episode, it's exactly how I think. Yes, client, for this year, if you choose this, it looks great. Long term, though, it looks like this. Are you still okay with it? Okay, so that 2-bucket framework is the one that I use when I'm doing planning for you. Because just that focus on the present and prioritizing that doesn't necessarily get you where you want to be. And so a number of years ago, I had a client who did as he was told. He was told to maximize his RSP every year by his accountant, and so he came into the bank branch and he did that. He knew nothing about investments, didn't want to know, just did as he was told. And his account got big enough. He was also getting older. So he was referred to me. At the time, I was managing investments and also doing the financial planning. I was working for the wealth management division of one of the big 5 banks, and so he was referred to me. He was turning 70. He had this RSP, and the RSP rules say by the end of the year that you turn 71, you have to convert that RSP, that retirement savings plan, into a RIF, a retirement income fund. And by the end of the year you turn 72, you have to make a withdrawal. And so he was in that age range. He was still working. He had no intention of stopping working. And his income was still in the highest tax bracket. And that drove his accountant crazy. And so that's why she would tell him to do this RSP contribution every year, because that was one of the tools she had to manage his amount of income in the top tax bracket. And so I was explaining what would need to happen to this RSP. It would need to convert to a RIF. He would have to take a minimum payment. It would be approximately this much, and it was going to happen in about 14 months. And he said, "Oh, my accountant's not going to like that." I said, "Well, I suggest you let her know then." And he said, "Can you do that? I think you'll explain it better than I would." And that's fair. So I called the accountant, and she was known to have a fairly abrupt communication style. And so I explained who I was. I explained the client that we had in common. And I said, "I need you to know that in this time frame, we are going to be withdrawing this much money for him, and it's going to be taxable." And she said, "What?" And I said, "Well, he has this much in his RSP now. He's this old. It needs to convert to a RIF." And she said, "How did that get there?" Pardon? She said, "How did that get there? Get it out. Get it gone." I said, "Well, did you recommend that he make an RSP contribution every year?" And she said, "Of course I did. He's in the top tax bracket." I said, "Well, he did that. And the money's been invested, and it's done well. And so now it's grown to this amount." And she said, "Well, get it gone. I don't want him to have more taxable income." I can't do that. That's what it is. Surely she knows how the rules work, yes? It was a hard conversation. But she was really shocked. She was genuinely shocked that this was going to happen. Now, I'm sure if you kind of, pulled her into a room and said, "Can you write out the rules of RSP conversion to RIF? And, what does that mean?" I'm sure she could write those out for you. I hope she could write those out. But when it came to this client, she was shocked. And she was angry. Like, her response to me was, "Get it gone." Well, I can't responsibly get it gone. I mean, the only way to do it once it's in there is to pick awful investments and have it go to zero. But who's going to do that? Nobody's going to do. Ethically, you're not going to do that. The money's there. We're going to have to deal with this. And so that's what prioritizing the present, that's where it can land you, is that you end up with a future that happens faster than you think, because clearly this caught her off guard, and it might not be what you think. And so why is it so easy to fall into this trap? Well, because he was getting advice every year on how to lower his taxes. So of course you would do that, right? That wasn't bad advice. What it was incomplete advice, because there was no conversation back and forth. He didn't have a financial planner before I met with him when he was turning 70, 71, right? So there was no opportunity for him to have a conversation about, if I do this today, what happens tomorrow? Well, this is what happens tomorrow. That was a known outcome, but the accountant was shocked. So it's very easy to fall into this space of, if I do the right thing today, then we extend that and we think, well, obviously tomorrow will be fine. I'm making good decisions today. Yes, that's how it works. Good karma. That's not how your money works. Sometimes the things that we do today, we don't actually want the outcome tomorrow. And so, again, this is the value in planning, because you get to choose. You get to look at today, you get to look at tomorrow, and you get to decide, do I want that? If I don't like the way that graph looks tomorrow, then we're going to talk about how to change it. But once you're there, your options are limited. It is what it is. And so that's what can happen when you prioritize the present and don't look at the future outcome of all of the choices that you're making today. And so how do you know that you're doing this? If you've been listening to me talk and you're thinking, good grief, I have no idea what it looks like tomorrow, you probably should get a plan. You need to know, because you can definitely be driving yourself down the wrong path or not the path for you. And it can be hard to switch. The longer it goes, sometimes the harder it is to switch paths. And sometimes there are real financial consequences to that. And so if you were listening to this segment thinking, oh boy, I don't have a clue, get a clue. Get a clue today. There's a couple of things that we'll put in the show notes about very high level on how do you calibrate this and where might you run into trouble down the road based on the decisions that you're making today. And that will give you a clue on how do you correct this. But your first way to correct it is to get that longer term projection for yourself. Go find an advisor that you trust, that you feel you can work with, that you feel is going to give you objective advice, and say, this is what I'm doing today. What happens 10 years out, 20 years out, 35 years out? So those are the three areas that we can really make the mistake of too much in. We can put too much focus on a single area. We can make too many decisions based on emotion, and we can prioritize the present too much at the expense of the future. And so what small step can you take right now? If you were making any notes, if anything really stood out to you in this episode, I want you to go back and listen to the suggestions that I've given you in there. And I want you to really look at all of your planning areas. And do you feel like you've got at least a start in all of them? And pick the one that you're going to work on next. So give yourself a quick calibration check on where am I? And what needs maybe less attention? What needs less emotion and maybe a little bit more objective math? And do I have a good view on, if I keep doing what I'm doing, what happens down the road, and do I like it? So if you listened to this episode and you felt like, oh, I'm actually doing pretty good. All of those things that she said you should be doing, I'm doing. That's amazing. That's such a fun place to be when you just feel like things are working well. I've done everything I can, and I can just keep doing what I'm doing until something changes. That's an exciting place to be with our money, because it can feel for some people like it doesn't happen very often, or that it took you a long time to get there. So if that's where you are, that is amazing. If you felt like, ooh, that's exactly the mistake I'm making, the fact that you had that reaction, also amazing, because now you can correct it. When you've called your own self out on it, now you can really do something about it, and you can contain it. You can contain that damage, and you can make different choices, and you can start to adjust your path so that you're ending up in a place that you do truly want to be and where you are truly financially stable. And so again, there will be some things in the show notes that you can get a little bit more information, get a few more specific details, and we'll also have the links on how to connect with me further. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the other episodes. There are 12 in this series, each one focusing on a different important aspect of financial planning. You can listen from start to finish, or pick and choose the episodes that matter most to you. Consider sharing an episode with someone else who needs to hear it. Thank you for liking and subscribing. And remember, no matter what you think of your financial situation, I've heard worse, which means you and I can make it better.